Well, a very warm welcome to Lesley Brydon, who first joined the CYC in 1966. But Lesley, your life began in Gladstone, Queensland. Tell us all about that.
Yes, Peter. I guess as a kid I was learning to sail trainee dinghies from what was then the Port Curtis Sailing Club. It was actually one of the oldest clubs in Australia. It was formed in 1880. But I also remember as a kid it was blown over in a cyclone in 1949, and then subsequently the clubhouse was rebuilt by the members, volunteer members who rebuilt the clubhouse, which still stands today. So it has quite a history. But Gladstone Harbour was really our playground as kids, and I used to get very excited every Easter at the end of the Brisbane to Gladstone yacht race. My parents were involved with the club, and there was a practice of billeting out the crews at the end of the race. And we used to host people like Greg Cavell, who sailed an old boat called Huana, which he had restored. He was a great boat restorer. He was also quite famous for owning the Breakfast Creek pub, which was very popular with yachties in Brisbane and elsewhere. People like Normie Rowe were there.
Normie Wright.
Normie Rowe, goodness me. Normie Wright, of course, who were famous boat builders on the Brisbane River. And George Pickers, who was a sailmaker. And of course the sails were old canvas, heavy old canvas things in those days. And all over town you'd see these heavy canvas sails strewn across lawns out to dry, while all the crews would be partying inside the houses all over town. It was a great time. So of course I grew up to think ocean racing was absolutely what I wanted to do.
Well, we'll get to that in a little while. And what got you to Sydney?
Well, I came to Sydney. I studied pharmacy, and I came to Sydney. I was running a pharmacy in Potts Point, King's Cross, I suppose it was in those days, and it was called Park Lane Pharmacy and Headache Bar. And one of my customers was a chap called Lesley Brydon, who was living in Elizabeth Bay at the time, and he was running Rupert Murdoch's business in Sydney. This was Rupert's first move from Adelaide. This was 1964, 65, and Rupert had bought the Daily Mirror and Cumberland newspapers. Curly was running those, but Curly was also skippering Rupert's yacht Ilina from the Cruising Yacht Club. And Rupert loved sailing, but he never wanted to be bothered with organising crews or having to maintain the boat. So Curly took control of the boat as well as the business here. So I joined the club around that time. Curly and I subsequently married. It was shortly after Ilina had done the Brisbane to Gladstone race, and I happened to be up there on holidays, and I remember working in the shop with my father, and I looked up and in walks Curly and Rupert and Mickleborough into the shop.
A handy trio.
And Curly said, "Hey, Dale," he said, "do you want to come up to the Whit Sundays?" He said, "We're all taking the boat up." He said, "You might like to come with us." So that was the beginning of the great romance, I guess.
Well, that's wonderful. And also, you mentioned Mickleborough and Curly. We knew and loved them both. I mean, they were wonderful characters, weren't they?
Well,
the shenanigans they got up to.
The story's a legend, Peter, as you know, and I think David Caulfield captured quite a few of them in his Ratbags to Respectability book.
Where would Mickleborough and Curly fit into that title, do you think?
Where did they fit?
Where would they fit into the title? Ratbags to Respectability.
Ratbags and Respectability. Well, I don't know. Curly had moments of respectability. I'm not sure that's true of Mickleborough. But anyway, I mean, in those days, of course, it was quite acceptable to be a bit of a ratbag. People had a sense of humour. I'm not sure that those things are viewed in quite the same way these days. I think we take it all too seriously, don't you?
Yeah, well, we do for sure. But so that introduced you to the CYC, and
yes,
I made a lot of friends here. And
became a member here, and I used to sail regularly on Ilina. It was mainly, for me, the harbour races and short offshore races. They didn't think I was serious crew material for the Hobart. So, in fact, women generally weren't regarded as being of any value on a boat at all at that time. But they did allow me. I mean, I was expected to pull my weight in the crew. It didn't stop them making me grind winches, and I had to do a session on the helm. And I'll never forget one day, actually, we'd done an offshore race and we were coming back in through the heads, and the boys were all, it was pouring rain, pelting rain and cold, and the boys were all down below having a rum, and I was steering Ilina through the heads. And then there was a sudden squall, and somehow or other I got knocked overboard. And the boat was getting quite dark too. It was just on dusk, and the boat sailed on without me. And I was in the middle of the heads.
Good heavens.
In the water with this wet weather gear on and shoes, of course, and nothing to stay afloat. Anyway, another boat came through the heads and they threw me a life ring. So I was struggling towards this life ring and just about to grasp it when I realised Ilina had woken up to the fact that I was no longer there. They'd come back and Curly says, "Leave her alone, she's ours," like I'm some prize fish or something. So they hauled the life ring away from me, and there I was trying to scramble on board up the side of Ilina. I tell you what, it was miraculous.
Yeah,
I mean, superhuman effort.
Well, they were obviously very caring then.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. But I mean, those you look back at those characters on Ilina. We mentioned Don and Curly and there was Brucey Jackson, Dickie Logan, and those blokes, and Barry Gallant. I mean, it was an extraordinary group of characters.
Yes, and then of course there was the famous Thunder and Raw Meat, Harry Kerslake and George Pearce.
And Earrings.
And Curly, of course, was great. Everybody had a nickname. I think that was a sort of a legacy of his Air Force days. I think because Curly, of course, was a famous Spitfire.
Yes, he was.
Oh, sorry, not Spitfire, Seafire and Kitty Hawk pilot.
Yeah.
And he, in fact, got a DFC in Bar. He was much awarded for what he'd done during the war. As a very young, he was Australia's youngest squadron leader.
Was he?
So he was a natural sort of leader of men.
Yeah.
And I think he learnt a lot of his troublemaking skills too in the Air Force.
And what was Rupert like at that era?
Yes, well, Rupert was quite young. He was, of course, in his 30s then, early 30s, when he came into Sydney. He'd inherited the Adelaide News from his father. But he was extremely ambitious, and there was always a sense of purpose about Rupert. He kind of didn't mind having a bit of fun on the boat, but you could see that he was always preoccupied and he always had a bigger plan. But sailing with them, I was, I guess, lucky enough to be able to entertain a lot of his famous friends. I mean, when Max Aitken, who was the Beaverbrook,
Lord
head of the Beaverbrook, and Jocelyn Stevens, who was head of the Daily Mail. People like Ted Heath came to Australia for the Southern Cross Cup. Rupert was always entertaining them, so I was able to...
So you mixed in the right circles.
Well, yes, it was quite interesting, always. But I was always there in the galley, Peter, I can tell you. I was expected to dish up pretty fancy meals in those days, so I had a bit of practice at all that.
Well, I'll move forward a little bit. That obviously stood you in good stead, because I'll take you now into the yacht Ballyhoo that Jack Rooklyn had built, Ben Lexon design, and the yacht was launched in late 1974, and then in 1975 it set off to go to America for the Transpac race. And I think I'm right in saying that Don Mickleborough was in charge of the crew, and he asked you to join as the cook.
Yes. I had to pass scrutiny under Jack's watchful eye, however, and I had to cook a meal that he was satisfied with. So they gave me a test run on the Brisbane Gladstone race. The boat, as you know, had done the Hobart in '74, and they'd had a nasty incident in Bass Strait when it fell over and
Capsized, basically, yes.
Yes, and they had to cut loose the rigging in order to get it back up again. But at the post-mortem that they had then with the designer Bob Miller and the Halversons, Bob decided it needed more lead in the keel, so that was done. But we never had a chance to try it out until we
But boy, did you try it out. So you did the Brisbane Gladstone race and then took off for America.
Well, yes, we took off from Gladstone. We'd finished the Gladstone race.
It sounds a very idyllic trip, but it was far from it, wasn't it?
Well, it was...
Tell us about it.
Everything that could have gone wrong, I think, went wrong, yes. And much of it was the fault of the boat, I think. Bob Miller was inclined to think it was the fault of the crew, but of course that was debatable. Even leaving Gladstone Harbour, I remember we were being farewelled at the club by our mates and my family, of course, who were all a bit worried about everything. And we hadn't gone a few yards when the gear shift jammed and the boat ground to a screaming halt. Anyway, we had some talented crew on board. We had people like Berkey, Dave Burke, Tom Stevenson, and of course the delivery trip was being run by Stan Darling. And Stan was the legendary navigator, and he was a fabulous skipper. Anyway, Berkey got the thing going again, and we headed off. We were on the tide because we wanted to get out through. It's a busy shipping channel through Gladstone Harbour, and we needed to capture the tide in order to get out. But we were halfway, I guess, out the harbour in the channel when the engine ground to a screaming halt again. And it turned out to be a busted fuel lead, which was quite serious because it spurted diesel into the bilges, and we had to get the sails up pretty quickly because there was a good chance we were going to drift in front of a tanker that was coming through the heads. Anyway, we got the boat going again, but the smell of diesel was there for the entire trip to Noumea. And it's fair to say, Peter, it was one of the most miserable experiences.
And the weather was bad too, wasn't it?
We had seriously bad weather. We had a lot of very big seas and, really 30-knot winds plus most of the way. So being the cook was an absolute nightmare, I can tell you. And then various other things started to go wrong. But that leg of the journey was not as bad as the next one.
That was from Noumea to Suva, wasn't it?
We got to Noumea, and Jack joined the boat with his mistress Robin, and Tracy came on board. Don Tracy came on board. Tracy had been the regular paid hand, so he knew the boat well. But it was not long, and of course we left Fiji, and soon after we get this cyclone warning from somewhere in the south, and the weather really got seriously bad. I mean, we had 90, 100-knot winds, and we had no sails up. We had a sea anchor out, and we were sort of, I didn't mention that the automatic pilot had gone on us. So, it really was hard work. But we then realised there was something far more serious wrong when we saw water seeping up through the bilges, or in fact starting to flood up through the bilges. And the guess was, and it turned out to be right, that the keel bolts had pulled out from the hull and the keel was falling off. It seemed that all the extra lead that had been put into the hull had pulled out against the soft, because Ballyhoo was an aluminium boat and the metal was softer than the lead in the keel. So we had 3 areas where the water was just spurting through, and at that stage the automatic bilge pumps had broken down, so we were pumping by hand. We used to have an hour on the pumps and then an hour at the helm, and we just kept going like that. And of course, with the terrible weather, we were blown off course. instead of getting to Noumea in 4 or 5 days, it was, to Fiji in 4 or 5 days, it was actually 9 days.
And you hauled the boat out there and saw these massive cracks between the keel and the hull.
Well, when we hauled it out, yes. Well, it had to go up in one of these very primitive Fijian boatyards. And, I mean, Jack was having a nervous breakdown as these Fijian divers, I mean, they were just diving to put the boat literally by hand onto the slipway so that it could be hauled out of the water, and skylarking the entire time. And of course the whole town turned out. This was a great event.
Oh, sure.
So the whole town was out to watch. Yeah. And
well, anyway,
and Trevor Gowland was flown out from Halverson's to fix it.
So you finally got to America via Christmas Island. You stopped at Christmas Island.
Well, yes. Well, because we'd been, we lost so much time in Fiji. We were planning to go to Samoa. We missed that, and then we arrived at Christmas Island, which, of course, these days is called Kiribati. And in those days, it was just a little coral atoll with quite a big copra plantation. And interestingly enough, the copra plantation was run by a fellow called John Brydon. So he was the only. Well, there were two non-natives on the island. He and another fellow from the fisheries. But the islands, of course, had been used as the centre for hydrogen bomb tests in the 50s, when the British were doing hydrogen bomb tests out there, and all the remains of all their infrastructure was still there. The landing strips, the trucks, the jeeps, the roadways, and everything was just rusting away. Apparently, John Brydon said that they literally walked away, leaving about $100 million worth of equipment. And of course, the local people knew absolutely nothing about using it for any productive purpose. I mean, it's a tiny coral atoll, and it has a sort of centre which is called London on one side, and that's got about 200 people. And then there's another centre called Paris on the other side.
Very exotic.
And then in the middle there was a section called Poland, which was a sort of rundown village.
Amazing.
So it was quite an experience. And of course, we were meant to, because we were arriving as foreigners, meant to have our passports and health checks done, and there was nobody to do it. The police had all gone fishing, and there was nowhere also to buy supplies. They had a local shop, but all they had was sort of very tired old tin cans of corned beef and beans and things. But fortunately, they had a supply of Forex. Well, not Forex, I think it was Foster's. So we were able to get a sugar bag full of Foster's to take back on board.
Well, you finally made it to America.
And then the rest was fairly uneventful, I must say.
And what was the Transpac race like? Because that was the reason the boat was going to America, wasn't it?
That's right. And we'd been based in San Diego at Jim Driscoll?
Jerry Driscoll.
Jerry Driscoll's boatyard. He was, of course, the skipper of Intrepid, and he ran the most expensive boatyard in the world, I believe. Anyway, we were there to get some work done before the boat, and Jack was panicking because he was paying, I think, $2,000 a day to have the boat there, and wanting to get the work done as quickly as possible, needless to say. Anyway, we had that done, and we sailed, we took off from Marina del Rey eventually for the start of the Transpac, and it was July 4. The first leg of the Transpac, of course, is like a race within a race. It's the race to Catalina Island, which is about 30 miles. The whole race, I think, is 2,500 miles, but the first leg was 30 miles. And it was the only part of the race that's on a windward tack. So we did very well on that race. I mean, it was hilarious at the start because all the spectator craft were totally out of control. I mean, you couldn't tell that the yacht club had been running this for 100 years because they'd learned nothing about keeping the spectators under control. And of course, there's some really interesting boats there. I mean, the fabulous Windward Passage, Constellation, which is a great sort of two-masted thing, and Ragtime, which had won the previous race. They had some Japanese entries, but we were the first Australian boat to do the race. And as Don Mickleborough said, we had a real handicap because rule number 75B said that no Australian boat was ever going to win this race.
And Ondine, I think, was there. Ondine
was there.
Right,
of course, Ondine was an old rival of Ilina's and others too from the Hobart race. But anyway, we won the first leg. Bob Miller was on board for the race, and he was calling tactics largely, certainly for the first leg. And we worked our way through the spectator craft. And when we got to Catalina Island as the first over the line, you've never seen anything like the celebration. There were fireworks, people cheering. It was unbelievably exciting. But of course, I had to remember it was also the 4th of July. So they probably had all this in preparation. But then we took off on the rest of the trip, which was all downwind. And we made a bit of a serious mistake quite early in the piece because local knowledge of the trade winds and tides, etc., had sent the other boats on a much more southerly course. And consequently, they got a big advantage from the winds. We'd stayed high because that was Ballyhoo's best sailing angle, and very soon we ran out of wind. So that was really, really frustrating, I have to say. And with Mickleborough and Miller as watch captains, things did get a bit crazy, I must say. I have to say, they never lost their sense of humour, really, the whole time. But there was some quite funny times. I remember on day 5, I think, Mickleborough went to get his watch out of bed and he said, "Righto guys, today we're having a change. Today we change underwear. You change with him and he changes with you."
Sounds like Mickleborough. But there was one famous altercation on the race, wasn't there, between Jack and Bob Miller?
When we did get the wind, finally we did get into the wind, get a bit of breeze, and it was quite strong, 30-knot wind with a big sea. We had one incident early in the night when the halyard got stuck, and poor old John Stanley had to get sent to the top of the mast. The mast was swinging through, it's a 90-foot mast, it was swinging through a massive sort of degree of nowhere, and poor Steamer was up at the top of the mast trying to dislodge the halyard. Anyway, he did it without any fuss at all. I have to say he's a great crew member, Steamer. But later that night, I suppose it was about 2 o'clock in the morning, the wind picked up, Mickleborough was at the helm, and we were screaming along, and we broached suddenly, and all the crew downstairs were chucked out of their bunks. I was allowed to share the dry bunk in Joe's cabin, Jack's cabin on the opposite side to Jack, not the same side. But we were both chucked out onto the floor, one after another, rolling around, and Jack got up and screamed and said, "Get that bloody spinnaker down." And so Mickleborough calls for all hands on deck because it was all a bit hair-raising. And Miller's in his bunk and gets back in his bunk and he says, "What the hell for?" And Jack said, "Get up here. When I tell you to get that sail off, you get it off." "No," he said, "you're a bunch of useless bastards." He said, "The only thing wrong with this boat," he said, "at the moment is that idiot Mickleborough at the helm. We're not changing any sails," he said. "Stay in your bunks," he tells the guys. So, of course, they all go back. Jack's standing there screaming at him, saying, "Miller, you've already cost me $1 million." And he said, "In another minute, it's going to be another 5,000 for that spinnaker." He said, "You get up here and get that down." "Oh," he said, "you don't know anything about sailing, Jack." He said, "You're a useless sod." I'm not. And Miller said, "Nobody treats me like this, Miller." Jack says, "Nobody treats me like this, Miller." He said, "I'll get you." Anyway, Miller just ignored him, said, "Go to hell." and they all stayed there. And miraculously, the spinnaker stayed up all night. So Bob was right. But he does have a special instinct for the boat.
Yes. Well, you made it safe and sound into Honolulu, and
we did, yes, and then we did the round the state, the race,
yeah,
yes, where we lost the rudder.
Yeah.